1943, United States of America. While the war was already burning across Europe, America was fighting a different battle, one no cameras filmed and no newspapers described in detail. The United States understood something crucial. The next phase of the war would not be decided in the air or at sea alone. It would be decided on a hostile shoreline, against concrete bunkers, machine guns, and an enemy that had spent years preparing. That realization changed everything. In January 1943, U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall approved the most ambitious training expansion in American history. The objective was clear: prepare an army for a large-scale amphibious invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. No American force had ever done this before. Across the country, training camps expanded almost overnight. Facilities that once handled basic instruction were transformed into full-scale combat laboratories. Camp Forrest in Tennessee became a key infantry training center, pushing entire divisions through relentless physical conditioning. Camp Ritchie in Maryland was turned into a specialized intelligence and battlefield analysis school, where soldiers were trained to understand how the German army thought, fought, and collapsed under pressure. Here civilians stopped being civilians. The men who arrived were not heroes. They were factory workers from Detroit, farmers from Iowa, students pulled straight from college classrooms. Most had never fired a weapon in combat. Almost none of them understood what awaited them on the other side of the Atlantic. Training was not designed to inspire. It was designed to break habits and rebuild instincts. Days blurred into nights. Marches stretched beyond exhaustion. Full combat gear became heavier with every mile. Sleep was reduced to a necessity, not a right. Instructors, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns, made one thing brutally clear from the beginning: what you learn here will decide whether you live or die later. Soldiers were trained to function under constant pressure, to react without hesitation, to keep moving even when fear took control. They were preparing for something no American army had ever attempted before: a massive amphibious assault against a fortified enemy coastline defended by the German Atlantic Wall. Beach assaults were rehearsed endlessly. Men practiced exiting landing craft under simulated fire. They learned how to jump into freezing water weighed down by weapons and packs, how to regain balance while soaked, disoriented, and exhausted, how to advance when every instinct screamed to stop. Urban combat training followed. Abandoned towns and constructed mock villages became battlegrounds. Houses were cleared room by room. Stairwells, doorways, and windows were treated as death traps. Mistakes were corrected immediately and harshly. This training was not about elegance. It was not about heroism. It was about survival. American planners understood one brutal truth: the beaches of Europe would forgive nothing. There would be no second chances once the ramps dropped. And so, long before the first landing craft crossed the Atlantic, long before June 6, 1944, the war for Normandy had already begun on American soil. Late 1943 to early 1944, United States of America. By the end of 1943, training was no longer about learning. It became about selection. The U.S. Army understood a hard truth: not every soldier who volunteered would survive what was coming. And the beaches of Europe would not forgive weakness, hesitation, or confusion. At Camp Forrest, physical conditioning reached extreme levels. Infantry divisions trained under constant stress. Forced marches were extended beyond regulation limits. Full combat loads often exceeded 60 pounds, simulating what soldiers would carry on D-Day. Men trained in rain, cold, and exhaustion, because Normandy would offer no mercy. Sleep deprivation became routine. Mistakes were no longer corrected gently. They were punished with repetition. The logic was brutal but simple. Fear could not be eliminated, but panic could be controlled. Soldiers were trained to function when plans collapsed, when officers were killed, when radios failed, when landing craft drifted off course under fire. Instructors repeated one sentence again and again: on the beach you are alone, even if thousands land beside you. At Camp Ritchie, the war was studied from a different angle. Here the Army trained what would later be known as the Ritchie Boys, many of them European immigrants and German-speaking Americans. They studied enemy doctrine, unit behavior, interrogation techniques, and battlefield psychology. They learned how German officers reacted under pressure, how Wehrmacht units behaved when supply lines broke, how fear spread faster than bullets. These soldiers would later land in Normandy with the assault troops, not to fight with rifles, but to extract intelligence in real time. Meanwhile, amphibious training intensified along the American coastline. Entire units boarded Higgins landing craft and naval transports. They waited for hours at sea in cold wind and rough water. Then, without warning, the command was given. Ramps dropped. Men ran into the water. Training beaches were deliberately chosen for difficulty. Strong currents, soft sand, cold temperatures. Some soldiers stumbled. Some were dragged down by heavy gear. A number of men drowned during these exercises. The Army did not hide it. After-action reports were cold and precise. Losses were recorded. Training continued. As one instructor reportedly told his men, "It's better to lose soldiers here than an entire army in France." Live-fire exercises became common. Machine gun rounds were fired over advancing troops to simulate the sound and pressure of real combat. Explosions shook the ground. Smoke filled the air. The objective was not realism for its own sake. It was conditioning. America was no longer training individuals. It was building a system. Every soldier had to understand not only his role, but the role of the man beside him. If one fell, another stepped forward. If communication failed, movement continued. By early 1944, the transformation was clear. These were no longer civilians in uniform. They were men accustomed to chaos, to noise, to fear. They had learned to move forward even when everything went wrong. But one thing remained unknown: the date, the location, and how much all this preparation would matter once the ramps dropped for real. That answer was coming. May 1944, United States East Coast. The preparation was over. By spring 1944, entire divisions had been moved from Camp Forrest and Camp Ritchie to secret embarkation points along the U.S. East Coast. Soldiers were briefed only on what they needed to know. Letters home were censored. Camp names were erased from maps. Even some officers were kept in the dark about final destinations. Everything had been designed to simulate the unpredictability they would face in Normandy. In the final weeks before the invasion, training became shorter but far more intense. No speeches, no explanations, only repetition. Every soldier practiced exiting landing craft, advancing under simulated fire, clearing buildings and moving across beaches laden with sandbags, packs, and weapons. The emphasis was on instinct, muscle memory, and the ability to act under chaos. Soldiers knew one thing for certain: the landing would come soon. But no one knew the exact date. The beaches were still thousands of miles away, and the Atlantic could not be crossed without danger. During night drills on the East Coast, men wrote final letters home, polished their weapons, and stared silently at the dark waters. Many understood that they might not survive the invasion. Others simply accepted it. The lessons of Camp Forrest and Camp Ritchie were etched deeply. Soldiers moved as units, not as individuals. If one man fell, the next pressed forward. Communication might fail, orders might vanish, yet the advance would continue. Chaos had become a familiar companion. On June 5, 1944, the soldiers boarded the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. They were no longer civilians. They were no longer raw recruits. They were trained, conditioned, and ready to face what no man had faced before. Landing craft doors opened on June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy were alive with gunfire, smoke, and chaos. Every soldier's actions, practiced hundreds of times back in the United States, were tested in real time. Plans collapsed. Waves of men stumbled. Yet the advance continued. Soldiers moved forward because that was what they had been trained to do, not to wait for inspiration, not to hesitate for fear, but to act. They had been drilled to survive, and survive they did. While the media would later show iconic images of courage and heroism on the beaches, the truth remained. Victory began long before they crossed the Atlantic. It began in the muddy training fields of Tennessee, in the cold classrooms and mock villages of Maryland, in relentless drills that tested endurance, fear, and resolve. America did not just land in Europe on June 6th. It brought an army that had been forged for chaos, trained to advance under fire and prepared to win when everything else seemed lost. This was the army that turned the tide of World War II, the army that made D-Day a success. and the army that proved beyond any doubt that preparation on home soil was just as decisive as the battles fought on foreign beaches.